So we have Jess from South London, who's going to be talking about can Marxism explain the climate crisis. How this is going to work is that Jess is going to speak for about 25 minutes, and then you break off into groups and have group discussion for 10 minutes, and we have a whole massive discussion, and then Jess will come in and sum up. So without further ado, Jess.
Thank you, Haji. Okay, comrades, unfortunately it's pretty hard to start climate change meetings without sounding extremely doom and gloom. So bear with me and hopefully we'll turn things around by the end of the meeting. To start with, Jakarta, a city of 30 million residents, capital city of Indonesia, is sinking as a result of rising sea levels and worsening floods, and it's actually being abandoned by its government. The government is moving its officers, civil service workers to nearby island of Borneo and leaving the rest of the residents, mainly impoverished working class people, to a city that's sinking by about 20 centimetres a year. This is just one of the many terrifying headlines that came out this year to do with climate change. I'm sure you're familiar with some others. Cyclone Idai hit Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi in March of this year, and it killed over 1,000 people, caused over $1 billion worth of infrastructure damage. This is in Africa, one of the continents in the global south, like on the forefront of climate catastrophe. Droughts getting worse every year, floods getting worse every year. Africa, as a continent, creates less than 8% of global emissions, but is being affected the first and the very worst by climate chaos. So the last 5 years were the warmest years ever recorded in the 139 years since the NOAA started measuring global heat. So this means that, so I'm sure you've seen climate catastrophes, they're accelerating, record heat waves in Europe, Middle East, Australia, to name a few. Droughts getting longer around the world, conversely floods getting worse around the world. Basically, extreme weather events are becoming the norm. So basically, climate change is no longer a long way away. Something, to be debated in journals or by politicians in parliament. The reality of global change is global climate change as a result of us dumping carbon emissions into the atmosphere is something that's unfolding around the world as we sit in this room. And it's already destroying cities, putting Pacific islands underwater and devastating whole communities. Doom and gloom, sorry. So the United Nations IPCC report came out famously about 12 months ago now. It made a simple pronouncement. We have 12 years left to stop burning fossil fuels, to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared with pre-industrial levels. So this was a trigger that I'm sure you're aware of. Many of you are involved in these movements actually in this room. A trigger for this massive wave of global protests that we've seen in the last year. Greta Thunberg inspired millions of school students to walk out of school, strike from school to protest this inaction on climate change. So the last strike for climate between the 20th and the 27th of September saw 7 million people participate worldwide. This is historic. This is the biggest mobilization we've seen since the anti-war mobilizations in 2003. And the thing that's interesting about them, I think, they're actually in 200 countries, these protests. So places like Afghanistan, Thailand, Bangladesh had climate strikes. So it's becoming quite a global movement, I think, in involving people in the global south, those on the forefront of climate chaos. Extinction Rebellion similarly burst onto the scene about a year ago. You remember the pink boat in Oxford Circus in April, and then in October of this year, tens of thousands of people blockading the streets around Westminster. This is a very seat of power in one of the biggest imperialist countries in the world. It's a very radical movement. People are willing to be arrested, blockade roads, stand on top of trains, etc., to try and stop extinction as they see it, which is very real. So because once global warming reaches above 1.5 degrees, we may see the beginning of a process that is basically going to accelerate out of our control and unable to be stopped from the kicking in of something called feedback loops. So feedback loops are these mechanisms by which the climate kind of regulates itself. And once these break down as a result of global warming, we won't be able to stop them. They will just run away from us. So this is why people talk about runaway climate change. So as I see it, the climate crisis is like this ticking time bomb that we seem to, like, as a society, to be unable to disarm, or even worse, actually, there's no plan currently to disarm this bomb. And even worse than that, emissions are actually rising every year. Fossil fuel companies are competing with each other for access to, like, oil and gas reserves all around the world. And as I said, emissions are actually going up. And even worse, in places like Brazil, the Amazon is currently burning. This is the world's largest carbon sink, something that could absorb carbon in from the atmosphere, burning as a result of, like, predatory capitalism, basically egged on by far-right President Bolsonaro, who's illegally deforesting it to expand agricultural production, basically. And fossil fuel companies are actually looking towards the melting ice in the Arctic and thinking, like, licking their lips, kind of like, we can access some oil that was previously inaccessible to us because it was, like, under sheets of ice. Like, this is madness, right? Like, how did we get here? And, like, how does an understanding of Marxism help us understand how we got here? And even more importantly, I think, how will an understanding of Marxism help us get out of this mess? So there's a misapprehension that Marx was only ever interested in, like, class, politics, economics, etc. But Marx and his lifelong friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels actually wrote, like, very extensively about the relationship between humanity, civilizations, and the natural world throughout history. I think it's useful first to understand how Marx understood humanity as a part of nature. Like, it couldn't be separated from nature. We have to be in nature, exchanging matter and energy all the time through the air we breathe, through the food that we eat. He wrote that nature is humans' inorganic body, so we continue to have a metabolic exchange with the world around us. And humans must develop a relationship with nature in order to produce the things we need to survive. So food, shelter, and that's from prehistoric ages to now. Humanity has always had to negotiate this relationship. And civilizations and societies have rested on this relationship, this economic base of, like, food production. And whole civilizations have, like, risen and fallen with changes in our climate that have affected food production. So ancient Egyptian civilization, for example, so it relied hugely on yearly floods on the River Nile. So this was every year the Nile would flood the riverbanks extensively, and then when they receded, there would be lots of grains planted on the flooded riverbanks, and then these were, like, immensely productive. You get huge harvests from it because of this process, and that this led to, like, a really complex civilization, like, relying on this yearly flood of the riverbanks. And this kind of led to the civilization kind of developing religions that tried to understand, like, tried to understand the floods, tried to predict them. And the religion reflected this fear that, like, the floods would, like, one day fail them. And when they did fail, eventually, it was, like, a climatic reason, something called El Nino, which is this, like, complex interaction between, like, the ocean and the atmosphere. And throughout history, it's had, like, huge impact on different civilizations. Like, they thought it was a religious failing, like, it was a punishment from the gods, but it was a climactic event, El Nino. And this, when those did fail, it led to the complete breakdown of that civilization. Extremely complex civilization that rested on this yearly cycle. So Marx and Engels' view of history is called materialism. So it's a view of history that's based on kind of not the actions of, like, great individuals or, like, great ideas. It's an understanding of history that's based on the material realities of, like, societies. So the ability of a society to, like, feed and clothe itself, that determined whether you could then produce, you could pursue religion, arts, politics, etc. You first had to, negotiate your relationship with nature, and then from that negotiation, you would develop other things in the society. So there's this understanding it's sort of like a dialectical relationship between humans and the environment. So we change nature through laboring on our environment to create the things we need. And in that process, we also change ourselves. Different ways of organizing production begets like different methods of relating to each other, basically. Excuse me. Okay, so Marx and Engels understood capitalism very early to be like completely anti-environmental, like inherently from the very early days of capitalism. So they couldn't have predicted catastrophic climate change, but they saw very clearly that all other considerations apart from profit were completely subsumed under the economic system of capitalism. So they studied how agriculture and industry developed under capitalism, and they saw it as they wrote extensively, it's a uniquely destructive system as they saw it. And it undermined all those metabolic cycles that we all depend on. Okay, so in the early days of industrialization, Marx identified a problematic break from the ecosystems of previous agricultural systems. So firstly, peasants were violently forced off the land that they had a relationship with to feed and clothe themselves, to produce the food they needed to survive, and forced into large towns and cities in order to sell their labor. They no longer had a right to the land that they lived on for generations. They were dispossessed basically and driven in large populations into the cities to sell their labor in the first factories. So this removed the bulk of the population from the land where food was produced. So previously people lived and worked where their food was produced. And because of this shift, the nutrients were not being returned to the soil in the form of excrement. So very quickly, soil quality began to erode as farmland was stripped of its nutrients. It's basically a one-way passage of nutrients from the country where food was grown into the town where it was eaten, and no return of nutrients back to the soil where the food was produced. And then we then see the rise of fertilizer being used. We then see the use of guano being used to replace this nutrient deficiency. This is what Marx called the metabolic rift. He wrote about this back then. And this was a break, as he saw it, as in the essential exchange between man and nature. So that metabolic exchange we were talking about before. So he identified this very early in industrialization, basically. And this rift, still hasn't been solved now. And it's actually, caused all kinds of disastrous effects. Using guano, which is, if you don't know, it's nutrient-rich seagull excrement. So it's hard not to say poo or something, but basically through the use of this, it was it was a short-term solution to the problem, basically. The imperialists were plundering islands off the coast of Peru to access this guano. Some wars were fought over it, madness from the very beginning. These islands were plundered to take basically bird poo to the countryside to replace the nutrients, but it never essentially improved the soil. Basically, it was always a short-term solution, kind of delaying the problem for a little bit longer. And human excrement could have been used. It was contained in great quantities in the cities and disposed of in the waste in oceans and rivers, etc., which caused disastrous effects for the ecosystems there as well. And of course, led to buildup of waste, led to disease in the cities. So you can see, from the very beginning, the problems that Marx identified. So this metabolic rift now, I think, obviously still exists, but I would say it's grown into a huge abyss now. The separation between man and nature has completely grown in the last 150 years as capitalism has been allowed to expand and plunder all over the world. So our productive capacity is hugely grown, but with a complete lack of care for the environment, lack of care for humans. And it has an impact so severe that it's actually threatening the natural processes that we all rely on to survive. Every every being on this earth relies on to survive. So these short-term solutions are catching up with us now, and they actually can't be put off any longer. You know, as I said, 11 years away from, you know, catastrophic climate change. They're all catching up. And unless capitalism is eliminated, I want to argue in this meeting, these great productive forces that we brought into being just turned into great destructive forces, and we have only destruction, death, and decay to look forward to. So basically, carbon pollution from fossil fuel production has to be eradicated in order to limit global warming and save the planet. And we have the technology to do this in the form of renewables. You know, like there is actually a simple-ish solution to this problem. Like scientists and engineers have modeled that it's entirely possible for us to make a switch to renewables, and stop burning fossil fuels. But you know, why don't we then? If it's so simple, you know, why won't our rulers act to save us if we're facing extinction? And to do so would mean like challenging some of the largest corporations on the planet. You know, some extremely deeply vested interests. There are 20 firms on the planet right now. They're responsible for a third of total global emissions since 1965. Okay, so they're holding us all hostage. You know, burning fossil fuels, expanding their production, extracting record profits. You know, a very small amount of people really are gaining from this, and we're all going to lose out. And I guess to understand why the capitalist system is so wedded to fossil fuels, we have to look again to the beginnings of industrialization. So the first industrial mills in England in the early 1800s were actually powered by water. However, by the 1830s, coal had overtaken water as the most dominant form of energy. This wasn't like an inevitable transition. Water power has like lots of advantages. Sorry, excuse me. Water's free, okay? You don't need to buy it. It's pollution free. However, the disadvantages, the reason it wasn't used extensively, is because water mills have to be constructed next to a water source, a river, etc. And so that meant that they had to be placed in like rural situations. And it's difficult to find a disciplined workforce out in the country, basically. So capitalists would have to build settlements around these mills. They'd have to, and that would be extremely expensive and would be a big invitation for like industrial strikes, etc. from these workers. Coal means that you're mobile, basically. You can have your factory, your mill, etc. in places where there already was a workforce, so in towns and cities, etc. So basically, the ability to exploit labor more efficiently made coal more attractive for capitalists. Coal and steam power more attractive. So, and the logic of capitalism, once capitalists started to make this switch, those that didn't were left behind, basically. So this transition basically set us off on like a path of development with like fossil fuels from the very beginning of industrialization. It was like at the heart of our development. And economic competition meant that fossil fuel economy, which began in Britain, was soon exported all over the world. So, and then from then the introduction of like oil and combustion engines further drove this process. So the transition from coal to oil in the military is interesting story as well, actually. So in battleships, for instance, it was driven primarily, again, in order to exploit workers more efficiently. So there was only one type of coal that's like high grade enough to burn to like power battleships. And they're to be found in like Walsh, like a couple of Welsh mines. Winston Churchill used the army to break strikes in these mines in 1910. And then when he took over the army the next year, he started a program to convert all the battleships from coal to oil in order to, what did he say? Freeing himself from the political claims of the miners. So interesting, once again, exploitation is at the core of our use of fossil fuels. So, and then, the Second World War enabled the growth of like massive corporations as industries, all over Britain were geared towards war production. And this shaped the terrain in the post-war period. And military expansion continues to drive climate crisis today. So today, the US military is the single largest polluter. So we can see from like the infrastructure of modern capitalism, our economic system we live under has been completely built on fossil fuels. Multiple investments over years and years and years from the very beginning of its development. To write off these investments would mean writing off like trillions of dollars worth of investments for these corporations. Like corporations are not going to be happy to write off these investments and suddenly switch to renewables. It fundamentally goes against their need to expand their profits and to keep investments going for as long as possible. So basically, fossil fuels can't be peeled away from the capitalist system, and capitalism remains intact. They were from there from the very beginning. They've grown together. They're at the heart of it. So this is basically why our rulers won't act to save us. Why we seem to be spinning out of control. We're completely wedded to the idea of like continual economic growth. That's the system that we live under. So under capitalism, competition and accumulation are central to the functioning. And this is what makes capitalism so dynamic. It's able to move all over the world, change, develop parts of the world so quickly, so dynamic. But it makes it impossible to plan or control, basically. So to understand this better, Marx described two hostile relationships in capitalism. So the first, that between the worker and the capitalist, right? So the capitalist wants to pay the worker as little as possible for the amount of work that they can get. That's the source of their wealth, right? These profits that they extract from the worker in the form of surplus labor are then poured back into investment in technology and like more productive forces. So this is what we call accumulation, right? So maximizing profits from workers poured back into more productive forces. So there's no limit to the growth that can happen under capitalism, which makes it different from other economic systems in history. So the second hostile relationship is between the individual capitalists, right? The capitalists will always be working to maximize their profit to stay ahead of their competitors, basically. If they don't, they'll go out of business as another capitalist overtakes them. Marx called these competing capitalists hostile brothers, right? This division between competitive capitalists. If I don't exploit or access fossil fuels, somebody else will. Even capitalists are aware of the destructiveness of the system, right? But they're powerless to do anything about it or they'll lose out to their competitors. And because capitalism is driven by accumulation for accumulation's sake, we can see environmental degradation is central to that, right? It's based on everything is secondary to this need. Like capitalism just sees nature as like a source of natural resources or a dumping ground for waste, basically. So to break away from climate destruction, we need to investigate what Marx wrote about creating a completely different system. So there's been many inspiring moments in the last 12 months roundabout of climate resistance. But I think one of my favorites was the amazing speech that Greta Thunberg made at the UN Action Summit in September of this year. I'm sure you've all seen it. She's crying super frustratedly, saying like, what did she say? We're living through a mass extinction event and all you can talk about is money and endless streams of economic growth. She expresses the fury of the young people who are growing up now and seeing, they're, living in a world that scientists say will be uninhabitable, probably by the time they're adults. And they become the leaders of the climate movement. Greta's amazing, she can see clearly the illogicalness of the system that is still right now prioritizing economic growth over the future of like life on planet Earth, right? So system change, not climate change, has been a call that's been taken up by the movement. A completely new system based on human need and healing the rift between humanity and nature is what is needed. So a sustainable and socialist society, but what would that look like? And I think the growth, Marx wrote a lot about the growth of capitalism actually gives us the greatest key to defeating it, right? By pouring large populations into cities, into big, large workforces, it gives workers like a unique opportunity. Marx talked about capitalism creating its own gravedigger in the working class that it creates. Workers organizing and resisting at the point of production by striking, protesting, etc., have like an extraordinary power to fight back and overcome capitalist exploitation, and in doing so can reorder society completely. Basically, workers create the profits. Thanks, hard to even finish. Workers create the profits that capitalists rely on, and by refusing to work, they can hurt the system where it really hurts. They can bring the complete economy to a standstill. Extinction Rebellion and the school strikers have pointed the way forward in the last 12 months. You know, they're not going to sit idly by. We're not going to sit idly by and watch the planet burn. And importantly, they emphasize that through collective action, we can like hit back at the system. And I think we really need to deepen this resistance. Working class people have the power to bring capitalism to its knees. I think it's important to remember that Marx was a revolutionary. You know, the capitalist system cannot be tinkered with around the edges to be made more ethical or environmental. You know, the last 50 years, I think, proves that. You know, we're talking about a complete transformation. We need a world where the need for constant profit above everything else is the only thing that's prioritized. You know, under capitalism, we only produce things to make a profit. That's the only reason we produce things. Under socialism, we could plan to produce the things that we need. I think the fight back against environmental destruction should be linked to the fight back against like inequality, poverty, exploitation, racism. I think when the mass of working class and oppressed people take to the streets, a vision of a new world where the maximum of concerned people are involved in decision making is what we need to be looking for. And when the need for maximum profits over the needs of society and the environment are removed, and we can leave fossil fuels in the ground, we can not only save this planet, but create a society that ends inequality and repairs the rift between humankind and nature. Thank you.